All right, so today with this sort of first introductory lecture, I want to start out actually going back a little bit before where this course actually picks up. Technically, the course, which is 2020, is listed as the United States since 1877. But I think to really take off, you need to have some understanding of what had happened in the decade or so prior to 1877. So what I'd like to do is drop back just a bit and then pick up sort of at the end of the war, the American Civil War, in 1865. And as you probably know, it was in 1865, in April, that Robert E. Lee surrenders the remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse after Richmond has fallen and after Petersburg has fallen. Already, by April of 65, people north and south had been given some thought, though, to how the country was to be reconstructed. In other words, how the seceding states, or those states that were not in proper alignment with the Union any longer, might be brought back to a position where they could fully participate in the business of the country. Plans started to emerge during the war itself. In fact, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln had proposed what I guess serves as sort of the first major plan for how Reconstruction would look and what would be involved. Lincoln faced within his own party a sort of fractured difference of opinion, you might say, as to how Reconstruction should look. Lincoln himself, if you consider the Republican Party of which Lincoln was a part, if you consider it a sort of spectrum of political views, then Lincoln probably sat somewhere toward the middle. He wanted, like many moderates in his own party, to see the Union restored. He was adamant, however, that that Union would not be restored with slavery in place, but at the same time, he wasn't entirely set on really punitive measures, except as they might apply to the people in the South who were most responsible, in his view, for leading the South out of the Union. Now, on one end of the spectrum, you have the so-called conservatives. These sometimes would be Democrats who had been Unionists, who had sort of worked alongside the Republican Party, but also some Republicans, particularly, I suppose, those most engaged with business interests in the South, and for other reasons, who really mostly wanted peace. They weren't invested in the notion that the South had to be transformed in any fundamental way. They wanted the Union restored, and a sort of moderate peace would be fine with them. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, the far ends, you might say, you had the radicals. These radical Republicans had come to understand the war as demanding that the South, beyond just simply the end of slavery, that the South be fundamentally transformed, that its very social institutions, its way of life, needed to be changed, particularly if the rights of the freedmen, and by freedmen I mean slaves who are newly freed, that the rights of the freedmen could only be protected if the South was fundamentally transformed. So, by and large, what the radicals sought in terms of Reconstruction was really more punitive than either Lincoln or the more conservative elements of the Republican Party. The radicals wanted severe punishment, especially for the leaders of the rebellion. But it was also part of their understanding that anyone who had supported the Confederate cause actively should lose because of that support. And as a result, many radicals called for what we call the disfranchisement of Confederate supporters after the war. Disfranchisement refers to the franchise or the vote. And to be disfranchised simply means to be denied the vote. So that these former Confederates, not just military leaders, not just politicians, but just former Confederates might be excluded from the franchise, from the ballot box. The radicals also sought to put in place legal protections for the rights of the freedmen, these former slaves. They felt, and probably rightfully so, that a South that was simply brought back into the Union and restored would not be an environment in which these freedmen would be able to exercise their newly won rights. To that end, the radicals considered, or many of the radicals, I shouldn't be too set on that, I suppose, but many of the radicals considered part of their task to ensure the economic and social safety for freedmen that would be necessary for them to practice their rights, or enjoy their rights, I guess. Put another way, you might think of it in these terms, and really put very simply, it's hard to think about voting when you're dealing with how your family's going to eat, where your next paycheck's going to come from, when you're trying to hold down multiple jobs. These freedmen had come out of slavery with nothing to speak of, and in some ways their very survival was the key issue at hand after the Civil War. But the political implications of emancipation, something Lincoln had firmly backed, the political implications of emancipation could only be fully exploited by the freedmen if, in some ways, they could find a way to make a living and survive from day to day, to become participating citizens, not just a voting bloc. That's sort of where that old kind of phrase, 40 acres and a mule, comes in. Actually, it goes back to a period earlier in the war when confiscated lands were being redistributed across the South, lands that had been taken for failure to pay taxes or other reasons from Southern landowners, and was then turned over to freedmen so that they could begin the process of building lives for themselves. But for the radical Republicans in particular, this element, this practical element of survival, was firmly a part of their thinking on what Reconstruction needed to contain. And so that's why I say their idea was one of transformation of the South. Not just rights, not just an end to the war, but transformation. Two of the most important radicals, of course, and I'm just going to mention some folks in this lecture because I am moving quite quickly through the material. But two of the most important names you might want to remember would be Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, both of whom, as radicals, found themselves often seeking more from this process of Reconstruction than it would seem even Abraham Lincoln had wanted to give. Lincoln's plan, which he first announced in 1863, had called for a sort of amnesty or forgiveness for many, many Confederates in the southern states. His actual title, or the title for his proposition, was a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. It was founded on the belief that rebellion had been forced on a large number of Southerners, and that given alternative choices, they might not have supported the Confederacy the way they did. And what he proposed then was a plan of Reconstruction in which a general amnesty or forgiveness would be made available to anyone in the South who is willing to take a basic oath of loyalty to support the Union in the future. He did seek to exclude from this oath and this means of amnesty major figures within the Confederacy, those who had played a leading role. But basically, when 10% of the voters who had voted in the South in 1860, when 10% had taken that oath, they could begin the process of forming a new state and reconstituting state government. There were other plans for Reconstruction as well, some perhaps more harsh than Lincoln's and some perhaps less harsh. But by and large, it's Lincoln's plan that seemed to dominate the talk. It was always the touchstone for talk of Reconstruction as the war waned, and it looked increasingly as if a Union victory was in the offing after 1864. Meanwhile, in January of 1865, Congress had actually passed what would become the language of the 13th Amendment, which was ratified later in 1865. This amendment is one of three 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to come out of Reconstruction. And they're very important constitutionally and to what happens in the United States after the Civil War and even after Reconstruction. So we'll be coming back to those briefly. But the 13th Amendment is important because it abolishes slavery. I think it's inappropriate, as I think some people often do, to think of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 as abolishing slavery. It didn't. It only affected those areas still in a state of rebellion. And it was firmly tied to confiscation laws that had been passed much earlier in the war. The 13th Amendment is definite. It's the definitive statement, and it is definitive for the United States. So Lincoln was able to see that accomplished before, and this is kind of where this everything changes, before he's assassinated. The fact of the matter is, while Lincoln had proposed his ideas and while they seem to be rather moderate in tone, we don't actually know what Lincoln would have done had he continued in the presidency after April of 1865, because, of course, he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. Instead, from a presidential perspective, responsibility for Reconstruction falls to a very unlikely character, a fellow by the name of Andrew Johnson, who is actually from a little town in East Tennessee called Greenville, Tennessee. Johnson had risen from poverty. He grew up around Raleigh, North Carolina, and had been apprenticed as a very young man, and apparently didn't care too much for his apprenticeship because he ran away. And he eventually made his way to eastern Tennessee, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, and he set himself up as a tailor. But he could neither read nor write. And ultimately, through the help of his wife and through a great deal of effort, he managed to learn to read and write. And as his business improved, he got more and more interested in politics. And over the course of several decades, Andrew Johnson moved from local politics and local elections into state politics. By the 1850s, he would become governor of Tennessee and serve in the United States Congress both before and during the war. But he comes back to Tennessee early in the war as Lincoln's military governor for much of the state, which much of Tennessee had actually been taken from Confederate control after 1862. So Johnson returns to Tennessee and becomes the military governor. And then, for the 1864 election, Lincoln picks Johnson as his vice presidential running mate. Whether it was a good choice or not, I suppose that was for Lincoln to decide. But there were a lot of Republicans, and especially radical Republicans, who had their doubts about choosing a Southerner. And even though he was a Unionist, a Southerner who had been a Democrat before the war. Not a Republican, not even an Americanist, one of those former Whigs, but a Democrat. So this former slave, or the slaveholder, up through 65, becomes vice president when Lincoln is assassinated. Initially, radicals in Washington are, they're accepting. To the extent that while they may have their qualms, there's this suspicion, one, that Johnson may be malleable, that he may be someone they can work with, but also that he's not going to stray too far from where it seemed Lincoln was headed with Reconstruction. Johnson sort of proves them wrong. proves these radicals wrong. And in the summer of 1865, while Congress is actually adjourned, Johnson announces his own plan for Reconstruction, a plan that he seems to believe is based on what Lincoln would have done. Of course, there's no way to know for sure. Like Lincoln's plan, Johnson's plan, which sometimes is referred to as restoration, actually offered a pardon to any Confederate supporter willing to take an oath of loyalty. But for those who had engaged actively in leading the rebellion and had led the effort toward the Civil War, Johnson required them to seek a special presidential pardon. And it fit very well with Johnson's own politics. Andrew Johnson, though he was a Democrat, had not represented the sort of interests of the planter elite in Tennessee or in the South. Andrew Johnson, because he'd come from East Tennessee, actually represented a sort of Jacksonian politics of the working man, the tradesman, and the craftsman. Doesn't mean that Johnson didn't support planter issues like the protection of slavery. Most assuredly he did. But in his own politics, it was very much a class-related politics, fitting for East Tennessee before the Civil War. So it made sense that Johnson would want to see the planter elite, the very people he, as a Unionist during the war, had blamed for the whole rebellion, had blamed for secession, just as he blamed them for many of the South's troubles. High Confederate civil, its government, or military leaders would have to take or seek a presidential pardon. Also, owners of property valued at $20,000 or more would have to seek such a pardon. Johnson would also appoint a provisional governor for each state. And only when a majority, not Lincoln's 10%, but when a majority of a state's voters, going back to 1860, when they had taken the oath, only then could they begin reconstituting state government. And when they did, they had to revoke their state's ordinance of secession. In essence, they had to rebuke any former action that had been made that had led to the war in the first place. They had to ratify the 13th Amendment in order to resume their position within the Union as a state. And they had to repudiate, or say they wouldn't pay, debts that had accrued because of the Confederacy, because of the role of their state in the Confederacy, so that things like war bonds, for instance, were not to be repaid. Loans that had been made to support state governments or the military during the war were not to be repaid in the southern states. It is perhaps a touch more exacting than what Lincoln had at least asked for in 1863. But it turns out that for the radicals, it's just not exacting enough. And you can see their point. Over the course of 1865 and then into 66, you begin to see events occurring that would suggest that restoration as a plan of Reconstruction isn't going to change much at all about the South. Not really. We see in the South evidence, for one thing, of paramilitary violence. Now, some of this you can blame on the war, the effects of the violence of the war sort of stringing out after the war technically has ended. But this paramilitary violence is often expressed politically against political opponents, and it often involves issues of race. Efforts, if you will, to sort of begin to gain control over former slaves now that they're freedmen. We also see emerging in southern states the so-called black codes. These are laws, often vagrancy laws, which are intended on one side, the southern side I suppose, to deal with this constant flow of former slaves as they now began to move about the South, which is an expression of freedom. And often slaves were seeking opportunity. They wanted far from their masters, their former masters. They wanted to go to towns, to cities where they could find jobs. And also, and I think, for me at least, most meaningfully, many wanted to find family members who, because of slavery, had been sold away, who were lost forever. And now, with the war and with freedom came an opportunity to find sort of those who had been lost. Well, these black codes that were put in place, especially in the Deep South, sought to take these freedmen and put them back to work, to use the state and to use law to ensure that freedmen were tied down to a location and to a particular contractual arrangement for a year at a time. Some of the laws included aspects that required you to sign a contract early in a year. If you were found without a contract that lasted for that year, the state would help you find work and make sure you signed a contract that linked you to a particular place for a year. It wasn't slavery. It was wage labor. The contract involved payment. It involved wages. But in another sense, and I think the most important sense, you could almost say it was another form of slavery, because it denied these freedmen the one thing that made slavery slavery, and that was control over their own lives, choice. They didn't have it. The laws of the states basically told them how they would live and what choices they would make if they had choice at all. So we see the emergence in the South not only of violence that seems left over from the war, as if peace has not truly been restored. We see the black codes being passed in southern states to allow whites in the South to resume control over labor. And perhaps the most prickly point of all, especially for radical Republicans from the North, was that in elections held in 1866, it was often former leaders of these Confederate states, leaders who had actually led the states out of the Union, who were reelected to positions of power even in the federal government. One of the most interesting examples that I always think about is Alexander Stephens, who had been vice president of the Confederacy, and lo and behold, shows up in Congress in 1886, having been elected from Georgia. There were Confederate generals who, because they had been the important people before the war, naturally seemed to be the leaders after the war to oversee Reconstruction in these southern states. And I suspect it was also a way for Southerners to say, sort of already by 65, 66, yeah, you won, but so what? We're not satisfied with your victory, and we're not giving up the fight. We'll fight in other ways, in this case political. We'll send back to Congress to sit among you the very people who led this whole rebellion. And then you sort of have to imagine the northern political side, how, if you're a politician from Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or Ohio or Maine, how do you go back to your constituents and say, you know what? The Confederates, their leadership has returned to Congress. We've got black codes, which have almost sort of reinstalled this white domination of labor in the South. And we've got violence in the South to help maintain control. Guys, it's almost as if the war was useless, as if it had no purpose, as if nothing's really changed. For the radicals, it was really difficult to take, and they didn't take it. Their response was to push legislation to give the federal government, the United States government, greater control over Reconstruction of the South. And by the government here, what I really mean to say, and what I should say, is they wanted to see Congress take a more active role at the expense of the executive branch. Up through 1866, and continuing through most of the year, Reconstruction seemed to be a matter for Lincoln and Johnson, for the presidents. But by 1867, it was Congress, through legislation and then through the so-called Reconstruction Acts, that sought to assert control over the reunion of the states. One of the most important sort of agencies to operate during this period actually began or was created in 1865 during the war. And it was created to deal with the vast numbers of freedmen who were making their way to the Union armies in hopes of protection and escape from their slave existence. These freedmen caused great trouble for Union armies in terms of logistics, feeding them, housing them, clothing them, just helping them survive while you're trying to fight a war. So Congress in 1865 had created the so-called Freedmen's Bureau. This Freedmen's Bureau had the purpose of providing basic food, also shelter to the freedmen to sort of liberate Union armies from this necessity. But the Freedmen's Bureau becomes engaged in more than just necessities. They begin to provide educational opportunities for freedmen, to give freedmen the skills to conduct business, to make purchases of land, and to start understanding what it would mean in practical terms to be free. You also see agents of the Freedmen's Bureau looking to cases where freedmen can claim their rights as citizens have been abused. And you see the Freedmen's Bureau actively engaged in finding employment for freedmen. Again, very practical concerns. And I think it would be wrong probably to allow the Freedmen's Bureau off, so-called Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, to allow them off the hook without reminding everyone that the Freedmen's Bureau, as the shortened version goes, the Freedmen's Bureau really operated in a way that reflected certain racial ideas that were not only true of the South, but true of many of the agents of the Bureau and many Northerners. It was not uncommon, for instance, for the Bureau to think less about what type of employment they found for freedmen because the freedmen happened to be African American. But compared to the treatment freedmen might expect from many Southerners who were not sympathetic to the Union or to the radical Republican cause, who wanted to reinstate just a sort of total control over the freed population of the South, the Freedmen's Bureau, I think, did amazing work on behalf of the freedmen. And you can see this in offices across the South. So with the Freedmen's Bureau, the legislation creating it had to be renewed in 1866. And so it fell to Congress. And the reason I really bring up the Freedmen's Bureau and mention it as much as I just have is because it's one of a series of pieces of legislation that our old friend Andrew Johnson decides to veto. And Johnson's argument is that Congress, in seeking to push this legislation to renew the Freedmen's Bureau, is actually exceeding its authority under the Constitution. Johnson pins most of his objections to the Constitution of the United States and to what you might call a rather strict construction or very narrow understanding of that Constitution. Similar to the Freedmen's Bureau Act that Johnson will veto and that Congress will renew anyway, we'll see a Civil Rights Act of 1866, which Johnson opposes, which is intended, the Civil Rights Act is intended to protect the rights of freedmen, which are being threatened by black codes and also by the paramilitary violence that I mentioned earlier. Johnson, it turns out, is also no great fan of the second of the major amendments that I'd mentioned earlier, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th, you'll recall, abolishes slavery. But the 14th, which I'll let you read for yourself, the 14th Amendment, which is passed in June of 1866 by Congress and will be ratified in 1868 by the states, is actually known as the Citizenship Amendment. Really, citizenship had never fully been defined in the United States or in the Constitution. So the 14th Amendment says that all persons born in the United States are citizens, born or naturalized. And what that means is that African Americans, former slaves, are citizens of the United States with all the rights and privileges granted thereto. The 14th Amendment goes on to state that no state or no state government, is how you should understand that, shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. Now, what that means is that state governments can't just go passing laws like the Black Codes. You can't just pass laws that aren't applicable to any citizen, that are specifically geared toward or focused on a particular group. Because as citizens, these individuals, these Americans, have rights. If states did seek to pass such laws, the 14th Amendment gave the federal government authority to act, primarily by removing representation. But in some ways, the 14th Amendment was truly sort of punitive. For instance, one of the portions of the 14th Amendment entails that no debt will be paid which was incurred because of the insurrection, the Civil War. And the 14th Amendment bars any supporter of the Confederacy from state or federal office until such time as 2/3 of the House and Senate have voted to accept them. Now, this is clearly directed at those Confederates, those high officials who had been political operatives before the war, had led the rebellion, and then had been reelected to sit in the United States Congress. Congress, you see, is taking offense and then taking more control of this thing called Reconstruction. As you probably know, and just for purposes of brief review, the South, except for the state of Tennessee, the South and those southern Confederate states were divided up into military districts under the so-called Reconstruction Acts that were passed in Congress in 1867 and 68, so that each of the military districts created in the South would have a military governor who would have considerable authority to maintain law and order within each district. You can imagine how Southerners felt about this. It was the imposition of a kind of broad martial law that hindered their efforts to reestablish their own authority within their states. As for how the states would get back in the Union, under Congressional Reconstruction, that was to be accomplished really when a majority of eligible voters, and remember now, high officials and other leaders couldn't even serve in office, so they couldn't run. But when a majority of eligible voters had taken the oath, and when the states had disfranchised ex-Confederates, when they had ratified the 14th Amendment, when they had guaranteed protection to black voting rights, and here's a kicker, when they had congressional authorization or approval. In other words, under Congress, there's now a whole series of steps that the states must take to resume sort of their traditional position as one of the states of the Union. Only then would military rule come to an end. Congress has acted. They've responded to what they consider a rather lax approach by Andrew Johnson to this business of Reconstruction. And they're going to act further. Without going into great detail, they will seek to impeach President Johnson over a law from 1867 regarding the control of the president's cabinet-level appointments. Johnson balked at Congress's assertion of authority in these matters and essentially broke the law to create a test case, which ultimately then led to his impeachment. This act, known as the Tenure of Office Act, in some ways represented the apex of radical power. 67 and 68 were the key years, because through the Tenure of Office Act, over which Johnson was so angered, Congress was able essentially to bring a president to his political knees. Johnson fought the charges which were made in the House of Representatives. He fought through a trial in the Senate. He squeaked by to retain his presidency and really was politically handicapped forever after, at least on the national level. But at the same time, the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson revealed fractures among the radical Republicans as well. Fractures that were revealed because Johnson in the end wasn't voted out of office, suggesting that there were limits to which some radicals and some Republicans would actually go in pursuit of their effort to transform the South. So it's sort of there we began to pick up with the next section, the next lecture, if you will, looking at how, from this point of great height that the radicals enjoy in 1868, how we move toward 1877 and how Reconstruction sort of unravels. Or maybe it would be better to say how Reconstruction fades away.